Welcome to the Learning Lab on Element Versioning and Security. Now this Learning Lab is a follow-up to the previous Learning Lab on building an element in AF. But don't worry if you didn't do that Learning Lab. As with most of our Learning Labs, you'll find a solution to the previous lab on the Learning Lab image. So in this case it would be to open up the database called solution myafdb_jdo. So there's instructions on how to start if you didn't do the previous lab. Now in this lab the objectives are to create a new element version. In other words, we're going to create a new kind of a revision of the element that we created before. Actually, revision's a bad word for it. You can revise elements all the time, and in any event after revising it you're still going to have the original element. When you create a new version of the element, you essentially have two copies of the element. You've got the version that's current and the version with the previous effective date. So as you can see, you can view the history of an element using this versioning feature. So I'll make sure we use the right technical term. It's not a revision, it's basically a new version. So an version in this case means it's a new instance of that element that has a historical component. We're going to demonstrate that by changing the query date to display the previous versions, and then we'll also go just briefly into how to change permissions for an element. So let's get started on this exercise. I'm going to switch over to my virtual machine, and I'd like to point out again, for those of you who are interested in finding out more information about any of these labs, if you go into the pypc/help directory, you'll find a bunch of Windows help files to cover just about everything that ships with the Pi server, and of course AF is very prominent in the list of help files. So for example, today we're going to be covering in the System Explorer, we're going to be looking at security. So this is where you would find more information, kind of the more detailed information on some of the things we're going over in class today or through this lab today. I'm going to start this learning lab by going into the Start menu and launching the Pi System Explorer. Normally you would find that under All Programs, Pi System. And we'll just use the Pi System Explorer application. Now, the last AF database that I worked with was this one called myafdb_jdo. But of course, if you're doing this at home or on the online learning labs, it may be that there's a different lab or a different AF database selected. And if you did not do the previous exercise and you don't have this database, we always have the solution available. So you can always open this up and then start working with tank A on the solution. In this case though, I'd like to continue the work that I did in the previous lab, so I will open this up. There's my tank A, and the point of today's exercise is to create a new version of this tank A. A tank A, if you recall, that is an element that I built based on an element template called tank template. It's a template that defines these attributes, density level, etc., etc. Have a little picture, serial number, etc. These are all the things. This is my cookie cutter for an element that resembles a tank. And if I look at my element list, I have so far stamped one cookie out of that. I've created one element based on that template. Now that particular element has a single version out there right now. It's a version that has an effective date of January 1st, 1970 at noon or at midnight. Anybody want to guess what that is? That's actually represents 0 in the time stamping that we're using within Pi. Pi starts counting time as a 32-bit integer starting from 0, and as you can see, this 0 is January 1st, 1970. Every once in a while you'll see that when working with our objects. The effective date or the start date begins January 1st, 1970. Well, in this case, that means that from 1970, the beginning of Pi time, to right now, anytime I want to look at an effective date within that range, I'm going to see this particular version. That's its effective date, and I have no other versions. Now, if I go in and make some substantial changes to this element, like I go in and start changing some of the attributes or changing some of the fundamentals here, then this revision will increment, but there's still only one copy of this element. There's still only one version. In order to create a new version, as you can see, it's really quite simple. We just click on New Version, or we can right-click over here and say Oh, where did it go? Create version. So either way, that's going to generate a brand new version. I will accept the default, which is the current time. And when that's finished, we should see that we are now on version 2. That version 2 has a new effective date. And to prove this works, as is called for in the exercise, to prove that this works, I'm going to change its product. So instead of HC 1500, I'm going to switch. This particular tank is using AQ 4500. It's a different product. Now if you remember, depending on what the product is, that's going to retrieve a different density. We're storing product and density in this table over here. Yeah, so if you look at AQ 4500, that's got a different density, and that should result in a different density in the element. Now I just made a common mistake. I've made this several times. I keep forgetting I'm in the library and I choose the element template. Let's make sure you go back to the elements here. The element template, of course, looks a lot like the element because the element was based on that template. So I'll go back to elements. I'll go to tank A, and we can see this product AQ 4500 is now been the assigned product. And the density, well, as soon as I refresh this, the density will come back as that new density. So I'll go ahead and choose a refresh. Right click, choose refresh. As you can see, the table lookup is now looking at the density for that new product. Well, that's the product for the version that has this effective date, version 2. I can view the previous version and look at the previous product and the previous density just by changing the query date. First of all, though, let's take a look at the history of this element. I'll choose this from the little browser here. I'll choose Show History. As you can see, here are the two different histories. We have one with an effective date of 1970, and we can see things like, see the product value is HC 1500. If we take a look at the more recent one, the product value is AQ 4500. So as you can see, it's a new version. Now again, maybe this is belaboring the obvious, but let's take a look at the last step in the exercise, which is to inspect this by switching the query date. So see, right now we are looking at just the default query date, the current date on System Explorer. And so we're seeing product AQ 4500, density 8.9. If I switch the query date to, let's just go with, say, 2007. Oops. Yes, sometime in 2007, July 1st, 2007. If you notice, immediately, because that's the query date, we are seeing the previous version of this particular element. So if we look at version, there are two versions. We're currently looking at version 1 with the effective date of January 1st, 1970. By the way, a little bit of trivia here. Notice there's no data for the level, the mass, and the volume. That's because we didn't have any data, or I should say the data is listed as bad because there was no data on the Pi system for that particular period of time. That predates the data that's on this particular machine, July 2007. And again, if I want to prove this is happening, if I go into query date here, and I specify a query date of set to now, as you can see, this is changing back to AQ 4500. Now I want to demonstrate something that's not really on the agenda here and on the learning lab, but it's just to demonstrate the power of using this versioning capability. I just started up a copy of ProcessBook. Within ProcessBook, I'm just going to do a very simple display. And on that display, I'd like to draw a trend. Let's do a trend of a tag CDT158. Has a default 8-hour timestamp. Now what I'm going to do is go into build mode here and make use of the kind of the whole point of data directory is to be able to find these things using kind of an asset-centered view. So I will go in and connect to this database, and I will use this asset called tank A. Before I do that, I just want to point out I did do a check-in before I got to this point. So within AF, I do a check-in to make sure that all the things that I've just done, including the versioning, etc., has been checked into AF. That's how you do that. It's essentially a save. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out this tank A from my list of elements. And I'll drag the one thing that we can look at that changes from one version to the next. Let's look at the, this would be the product. And I'll just drag this over here. As you can see, that's the current product. Here's the current density. And watch what happens when I do something as innocent as scroll backward in time. I'll go back into run mode. I'll scroll backward in time. And immediately, because of the versioning that we've got implemented in the AF, we see the previous version of this tank. It was that product, and that was the density. So that's an example of how this provides a kind of a context layer. You know, the versioning is now used to identify what was what within the your asset model at that particular time and place. So let's move on to the last section in our exercise, which is on security. I'll go ahead and close out of process book. And the last step is to go in and modify security settings. And that's rather anticlimactic, because if you're familiar with Windows, it's really straightforward. Just right-click, choose Security, and then you get to, well, you'll notice AF is very tightly integrated into Windows security. So you can choose, using the normal Windows conventions, who has access to what. And of course, there are mechanisms to associate your Windows login with your user in Pi, so that the security that the person that you're logged in to as a Windows user, that information is picked up by Pi and mapped to a Pi user, either a common user shared by people or a user specific to you that's mapped to that Windows username. In most cases, the same name as the Windows username. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to find out more information about this, again, just go into the help file. In this particular case, you'll find more information about security under this section on the Pi System Explorer. Now, this is how we describe setting permissions. Okay, well, thank you for doing this learning lab. Again, if you had trouble with the lab at all, by all means, just go into the solution lab, the solution AF database right there. Take a look at the solution there. If you do have any problems, if the lab didn't work the way you wanted, please contact me, Nick. I'm the e-learning manager here at OSIsoft. You can email me at training@osisoft.com. Thanks.